Yeah, you're here. It's an education conference, call and response.
It can be done.
So, one, I just want to start by thanking everyone who is here at 2 o'clock on the Wednesday after Bill Gates and the sun is out. Like, this is big. Second, hopefully this will turn into an open dialogue, not only among us, but with you. And so at any point during the conversation, you feel like, as so moves to raise your hand to ask a question, feel free. I will make a decision about whether to call on you or not. But, I'm excited to have this conversation for a whole range of reasons, mostly because I just lost my slide. For a whole range of reasons, both my past and my present, but mostly about the future. I will allow you to meet this fabulous panel in their, when they introduce themselves. I hope that you actually read their full backgrounds. But just to make sure that we're clear, Susan Cates, Bror Saxberg, and Sonya Kristen. We have representation from folks who've got, graduate schools that are ranked, from for-profit colleges that span, from for-profit companies that have a range of things from universities to test prep, to a community college with an outstanding reputation, not only for access, but for actually getting value to students in terms of what they get out of it. I shouldn't say actually, for doing that for folks. So we got a range of perspectives here, but what we're going to talk about is outcomes and value. There's conversations going about free, and importantly, there are lots of people starting to say, hey, we know how to describe what higher education does for students, and how they ought to be thinking about what they're getting from it. So I'm going to talk for just a couple of minutes just to put out some thoughts. I love arguing with both my panelists and with you. So I'll put some thoughts out there for us to think about, and then let them tell their stories about where they're coming from, their perspectives, what they think about it, and then we'll get you into the conversation. So let's start the story here. Everybody know about the scorecards? The guy who's responsible for those is actually here in the room. There he is. So the reality is, what is happening around us is radical transparency is about to transform the way people look at higher education. You've got the federal government in the business of collecting data and reporting it. You've got PayScale. You've got LinkedIn that now are taking the inputs from their own members and others that they survey to tell you what the outputs are and what the results are for the students. You've got now lots of sites collecting and surveying students about their experience. You've got Gallup trying to come through with their quality of life. Lots of different ways that folks are going to get a look at the university and make a determination, I shouldn't say the university, about post-secondary institutions, and make a determination about whether they're good or not, whether they're delivering against their promise or not. And so what I want to start the conversation on is, one, what are the kinds of things that are actually important? Because a lot of it skews right now very much to the stuff around, do you get a job and do you get paid enough to pay for your debt? Important stuff. But I think there's more, so I'm just going to run through a quick list and then let other people jump into the conversation. So here's the list. Forgive the alliteration, right? But it comes down to, right now, 5 A's. There may be more later. Access, right? Can students from a variety of backgrounds, regardless of their life experience and life circumstances, access the program and be successful if they have the proper preparation? Is it affordable and flexible, and can it meet them where they are? Second, achievement. Do students learn the knowledge, skills, dispositions, and behaviors they need to be not only good professionals in their fields of study or to go on to the next level of study, but also to be thought leaders over time? Advancement. Like, people want jobs. They either want to get a new job or get promoted or get an increase in their pay. And shouldn't that increase justify the investment they're going to make in their education, regardless of what it happens to be? And I'd say, as a person who was a steward of public resources, regardless of what they pay, what we pay as taxpayers who support lots of these systems. Something that doesn't get talked about a lot, affiliation. Most of the folks in this room, if you came to this session this afternoon, then you're probably aware of the Brookings study that showed that you can actually tier the return that students seem like they're getting from their education in the post-secondary level by the tier of income that they're coming from. Like, Isn't that funny that the thing that's supposed to create opportunity actually seems to maintain the stratification that we're trying to overcome? So one thing that we know is social capital plays a role in that. So affiliation. Do students increase their social capital? Do they build stronger peer networks? Do they build networks of mentors and experts they can access over time that can help them support them personally and professionally through their lives? By the way, some of these things are easier to measure than others. Lastly, aspiration. People go to school for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is to become a better version of themselves, to become a part of something bigger, to do something bigger with their lives. Do we help people understand what they think their purpose and their passions are? And how do we help them actually to pursue those things through what they do with us in our institutions? And is that important? And if it is important, how should we measure it? So those are the A's right now. Those are the outcomes that I want to put forward that need to be included in the definition of whether post-secondary institutions are delivering. And that when we start to talk about even things like student choice and accountability, that ought to come into the conversation. So with that, I'd love to turn first to you, Susan. So Susan has got an interesting thing going on here, and just for full disclosure, she just left UNC's School of Business, the Keenan Flagler School, but has also just joined 2U as a COO. So I'm not going to be just nicer because she happens to work with me now. But she does.
I'm sure that's true.
She does bring a couple of different perspectives. One is obviously on the side of the university, and the other is on the side of someone who's trying to figure out how do you help a lot of other universities to deliver against these outcomes or others that you think are important. So I'm going to ask each of you to say, like, am I crazy? Are these things that I'm talking about the right things? Did I miss anything, or am I just wrong? And second, given your background, how do you think that you think about the outcomes and whether or not they matter and whether or not they produce value for students?
Sure. Absolutely. And as Jim mentioned, I'm 2 weeks into the new role at 2U. So I apologize in advance for using we indiscriminately when I refer to UNC or 2U. It may take a while for me to come out of the we on both sides of it. But I actually think that's kind of representative of the way that we, 2U, think about our partnerships with universities. We are very focused on outcomes. And for any of you who have ever heard Chip talk about this, you've heard him say that we as a company convinced our board early on that our success as a company was going to be tied to student outcomes. And I think that's a big part of the success of 2U in building these relationships with universities, because having been on the university side for 6 years and having been one of the very first partners for 2U, we always felt, UNC always felt that we were aligned with each other in caring about the outcomes for our students, that we cared a lot about access, about taking the Carolina experience, taking a world-class MBA education and making that available to great students no matter where they were, and not requiring that they quit their job, give up their income for 2 years, or fly to us every other weekend and leave their family, or settle for something that may not be as good because they happen to be working in a great job in Iowa and they had fewer options. No offense to any of the universities in Iowa. But we wanted to be able to give people access to what we felt we could do for them no matter where they were. We cared a great deal and still care a great deal about achievement through the program. On the UNC side, we really looked at building the program as it had to be at least as good as what we could deliver for students who would come to us in Chapel Hill. And that was critical to us, because if we weren't able to add value for our students and make a real impact for them, then we weren't doing what was important to us as a university, what was important to us as a business school. And we felt very supported in that, in our relationship with 2U all the way along. So same admission standards, same curriculum, same level of rigor. And from talking to our faculty, we've been doing it on the UNC side for 5 years with students, enrolled about 1,400 students since we began. And the person who is stepping into our senior associate dean role at UNC in the next couple of months has been teaching in the program. It's a great course called Leading from the Middle. And he said, I really was skeptical about our ability to do this and for our students to get as much from it when we started. And he kind of looks around over his shoulder and he said, I really feel like our students in the online program are getting more from it in terms of achievement, in terms of what they're taking away, the learning that they're getting from it, and the impact that's having on their ability to move forward. On the advancement side, that's something that we track and pay very close attention to, both from the 2U perspective and from the university perspective. For MBA at UNC, which I will oversteer towards since 2 weeks into the job, that's the data that I still know the best. But our students were all working professionals. They were coming at it from a range from early career high potentials all the way up to CEOs and CFOs of publicly traded companies. Chip is not our only CEO of a publicly traded company in the business, actually. And yet, every student who is looking at making that sort of investment in themselves is looking to advance in their career. So over the last few years of delivering this program, we track advancement, career advancement during the program, because it isn't so much a placement after, it's how are you advancing during, how are you advancing in your career going forward. And we've found that 77% of our students have made a job change either in their company or outside of their company during the program before they graduate, with their average salary increase by 1 year out being 35%. So from an advancement standpoint,
Fantastic.
They're doing really well. And I won't keep going on all 5 A's because we'll leave some time. So.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Let's jump around. Sonya, you're coming at it from a very different perspective, the community college. One, did anything I say resonate at all, given the differences in some of the populations that you're dealing with, though community colleges serve more students than anybody in the country? And what are the things that you have to think about that I might not have laid out?
Well, let me start by asking how many in the audience are from community colleges. Please raise your hands. Okay. So I'm usually used to hanging out at conferences where predominantly it's community college folks. So quickly, I'm from one of the California community colleges. My college is Bakersfield College, and we serve about 25,000 students. And we have about 300 full-time faculty, and we have one baccalaureate, but most of our degrees are associate degrees. So getting back to the question that Jim has been posing in terms of outcomes, access and access towards success, not just access for the sake of access, about achievement and advancement. I think the lens that, at least at Bakersfield College, and I would say most community colleges would approach it, is the lens of equity. And at this conference, and by the way, this is the first time I'm attending the ASU GSV, and it's really phenomenal, because some of the ideas of the technology, the intersection of technology and entrepreneurship and education is where there's exciting things that are going to be happening. So back to the question of equity, whether it is related to access, Bill Gates talked about 1/3 of the students going into higher ed are first generation. At Bakersfield College, 80% of our students who come to our campus are first generation. So their parents didn't go to college. And about 80% are also economically from underprivileged. And a significant number, 64% are Latino students, and we have African American students. So the population coming in needs a lot of attention. So when you're looking at access, everything within the scorecard, and later in the conversation, if I have time, I'll talk about who's the scorecard guy that you pointed out to.
Poor Jack.
I'll talk about a scorecard we have developed locally called the Renegade Scorecard. We're the Bakersfield College Renegades, so it's called the Renegade Scorecard. But what you would find there, and what I'd like to highlight for you today, is the concept of equity. So in all of our data, longitudinal data that we track, when we're looking at the value provided by Bakersfield College, the value of community college education in this context, we take those outcomes that Jim talked about, and then we break it out into disaggregated data looking at the equity lens. So the effort when we try to find, the single point, the leverage point, to be able to make a difference in getting more students to progress through, and most of the scorecard data always has progression to degree completion, whether it is the White House college rating system or whether it's the California scorecard. When you're looking at that progression and completion at Bakersfield College, and for the most part in California, we look at the equity. Here is for students, how do you disaggregate the data and look at it? So when you move into student learning, again, on a programmatic level, so that's another piece when we come back, there's been a shift in thinking about outcomes in terms of learning outcomes from a programmatic standpoint, looking at employment in mind. And finally, even in advancement, again, are we constantly having that equity lens front and center? And I will end by saying, in the Brookings study, actually BC did really well. And we kind of figured it was because of our nursing and our healthcare programs and some of our industrial tech programs as well. So I'll wrap up for now.
Okay, fantastic. So Bror, I'd love for you to go, and in particular, I'd like to start to shift into a part of the conversation about, I know you put a lot of thought into the systems that you use to actually prove or disprove whether you're producing these outcomes. And so not only would I like you to react, but also to begin to talk about that as well.
Yeah, happy to do it. One of the interesting things about the framework you put out, the 5 A's, is it generalizes but also matches what psychometricians have been figuring out in terms of measuring learning over the last 50 years or so, which is it's a mistake to try to find the one test to rule them all, the one measure that will give you the final outcome. It's just as much a mistake in education as it is in healthcare. Imagine if your physicians only used blood pressure to decide if you were healthy, right? They'd have trays of leeches. Their commitment to healthcare quality would be you walk out of here with a normal blood pressure, whether you fall over on the freeway or not, because that's my commitment to measurable healthcare. Well, of course not. That's malpractice. And I would argue in education too, the testing research community is aware you actually benefit by triangulating. And so all those measures that you talked about are a way of triangulating to say, look, if we've actually given these people or this person a great educational experience, we should see the impact of that across all of these. And the same thing is true even within a subset, whether you call it achievement or advancement. In some ways, those two blend together. You don't want to know the grade point average alone. Honestly, you don't even want to know did they get a degree or not, even though, yes, that's a critical piece of the puzzle. You actually want to know more about the individual outcomes along the way. And you want to see longitudinal results. If they did well in an early course, apparently by the evidence, did they also do well in a part of a later course that depends on the early course? Because that's supposed to happen too, right? It's not enough to just get a high mark. These are supposed to be usable skills that you should see the consequence of later on, even into the workplace. If this guy has learned how to write or this gal has learned how to write, and you see that they got a high mark on composition, did they do well in their assignments here? And frankly, does their workplace say, I love this person because they're one of our few good writers? Well, now you've triangulated information to say, I think we got this. The other piece of this, though, that comes up, I think, repeatedly, and there's been a lot of good conversation at this conference about outcomes. What's been missing is the conversation about effective assessment of those outcomes. And that involves actually bearing down and building valid and reliable probes of the actual task you're after. And the trick here is a lot of assessments are only correlated to the outcomes you're after. So a story problem on something like Boyle's Law, PV equals nRT. Many of you are getting hives right now, remembering your high school chemistry. Right? That's a complicated thing for students because it's 3 things happening at once: pressure, volume, and temperature. Lots of kids fail. Your nice chemistry faculty member is building a story problem to assess that, sends it out to the students at a quiz. The sharper students get it right. The less sharp students seem to get it wrong. He or she thinks he's got a great question. It turns out a lot of those kinds of problems done by faculty are actually reading tests. They're not actually tests of Boyle's Law. If you were a very good reader, you'd figure out the answer was C. Now, in conventional instruction, well, you know, being a very good reader also contributes to being a good learner, and so you're kind of okay. But as soon as you want to do adaptive learning, something a little more aggressive, you're going to use that measure to skip somebody's instruction in Boyle's Law. But it wasn't the test of Boyle's Law at all. So now you're going to create problems down the line. So getting better assessments is critical. The final thing is, and this is the thing we've been doing a lot of at Kaplan, especially in Kaplan University, is really cycling the testing of different kinds of interventions using good techniques. So randomized controlled trials are not a publishing technique. They're actually an engineering technique. It's why Facebook and Google and, you know, all those great Silicon Valley guys, they're not publishing papers. They're using controlled trials to really tell, is this thing making a difference or not? So when we have some scale, any of us with learning environments or through collaboration have learning environments, it's actually very valuable to then try to compare and do some kind of randomization to actually look, is this really making a difference longer term? The last thing I could talk about is, where do the learning outcomes come from? So actually Michael Horn at an earlier panel referred to this. Research on experts show that experts have conscious access to less than 30% of what their own minds decide and do. Meaning, when they get up to talk to a novice about what do I do as an expert, they tell them less than 30%, because so much of it has become tacit, implicit, it's spinal. Yeah. It's a pattern they recognize when it happens, but they have no words for it. Well, there's real work you can do, things like cognitive task analysis that was just referred to in a recent report from MIT, the Online Education Policy Initiative report, that can help you unpack more of that. But almost no one...
Which I advised on when you say something like that?
Oh, well, I guess I should say, I may have had some role in the report, yes, in the advisory report. But one of the things they commented about was cognitive task analysis as a tool to unpack what is it that experts decide and do and get more of that into our outcomes, because you really want to tie your instruction to the things that top experts decide and do. You don't want to keep working off of what have we always taught people to do. You really want to target, no, today, what do top experts decide and do? So the connection from expert performance to learning outcomes, to valid and reliable assessments, to good controlled trials to compare one intervention versus another, is all part of helping students of all kinds really achieve their dreams.
So, one, thanks to each of you, that was fantastic. By the way, any of you folks on the side who want to come up to chairs, feel free to do it while I'm blathering for a second. So we talked a lot about the access, the achievement, the advancement. Those things are easier to get your arms around and easier to measure. I mentioned affiliation, and then I mentioned aspiration. I'd love to hear you talk about the importance of affiliation and how and where it matters. But also, Sonya, I'd like for you in particular and Bror to talk about it as well, because it's pretty obvious that UNC has a huge brand that they're trying to build people into. We'd love to hear about how you think about building community and associating your students with the university and each other, given the differences in the populations as well. Mm-hmm. Good deal?
Yeah. So I'm delighted to talk about affiliation. It's really important. You know, if you're from North Carolina, if you're a Tar Heel, you know, you kind of grow up knowing who you are by what team you pull for. And in fact, when I went to at true confession, I went to Duke undergrad and Carolina for grad school, which makes me a bizarre human being to start with. And when my daughter was 2, I looked at my husband and said, I'm really struggling with, should we raise her a Duke fan or a Carolina fan? And he's from Texas, and he's actually not into sports at all. And he looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and he said, why do we need to raise her one thing or another? And I said, look, you do whatever you want to on religion, but the child needs an identity. She's got to know who her team is. So, at Carolina, we take affiliation really, really seriously. And that's the case for all of 2U's partners, whether it's being a Trojan or a Hoya or a Tar Heel. Affiliation to the school, but to each other, to that community, to really being part of the culture of the institution is really important. And again, thinking about it from the MBA perspective for MBA at UNC, a big part of what was important to me as a student going through a full-time MBA program was that network, that social capital that you talked about, the relationships that you built, both for what that did for the learning in the classroom, because really pushing against each other and understanding different perspectives and what people brought to that was every bit as important to the learning experience as what the faculty was sharing in terms of the new concepts and the new frameworks and the scaffolding to build on. But what was incredibly important to my long-term career was those relationships that I built and the friendships that I built coming out of that, and how I could use those throughout the next 20 years post business school. And so, thinking about how do you build that in an environment where you're not bringing students to Chapel Hill all the time, where you may not bring them to Chapel Hill at all, where they're not sitting around the same table to have beers on Friday nights. How do you build that sort of that strong network, the strong relationships with each other is something that we thought a lot about, and that 2U thinks a lot about in terms of the design of the program and the design of the interactivity that's needed to build those relationships. We've seen that very much in the students who have come through MBA at UNC, where the vast majority of them, over 80% of them, fly in for graduation every time we hold graduation. They are building strong relationships and traveling together around the immersions. They're meeting in accounting class and going on to date and move in together, just like happens in a traditional MBA program. From keeping up with some of my former students through social networking sites, I saw that there was a whole group of them that had gotten together for a reunion in Miami this weekend, hanging out together from all over the country, and it is really powerful. And if we do it well, whether it's in an online delivery or in a face-to-face delivery, then you can build that sense of community, that sense of affiliation. And I do think that it is absolutely critical to a successful experience to build that sense of affiliation to each other in those relationships.
Well, two thoughts. The first one, I'm going to come at it on the affiliation concept through one of the outcomes that is made visible, whether it's a college rating system, is the wage outcome. So if an individual, completes a degree at one of our institutions and gets out there, what is their earning power, right? And there is value in that, I think, because in kind of Maslow's hierarchy, you've got to have living wages. So, okay, acknowledge, check, that's done. But when you think about, for example, countries that were titled developed countries versus underdeveloped countries, it was GDP, it was sort of an economic lens. But then it has evolved to looking at countries with a human development lens of life expectancy and education. So coming to that outcome, the wage aspect of it, I think, needs to be expanded using the age-old concept of, I'm saying age-old now, several decades now, of the triple bottom line. So the affiliation place, the way I would frame it, is when you're looking at the triple bottom line of economics and you're looking at social and the whole community being a healthy community and building up the whole community as a whole. And the third one is the environment, but if you turn it into sort of the ecosystem and the ecology, which many individuals in this conference have been talking about it, then affiliation matters. So, so a case in point will be when we start tracking the units, the student, that's a unit record tracking, right? It's not just wage data that we should be tracking. How is this individual contributing to different volunteer programs for the benefit of the entire community? So that recognition of advancing the community as a whole and that kind of a citizenship, those are important indicators as well. And that identity and that affiliation creates that community concept. And when it comes to the ecosystem aspect of it, the idea for an institution is, when the question was asked by the Arizona State University president whether whether higher education was going to be killed or annihilated, and he talked about the different waves, right? So again, using the affiliation concept, higher education needs to be connected to the entire ecosystem. And in community colleges, for example, there is a connection to industry because that's part of our mission. So that kind of a connection automatically creates not only an affiliation, but an adaptation that happens, which means it evolves and grows. So it's not in a state of stasis, but there's a dynamic nature to that. So I think it's extremely important, but I was just reframing affiliation from, number one, from a student standpoint, that in their contribution back to the society, it's not just economic or tax paying, but it's larger than that. And secondarily, from an institutional standpoint, the affiliation outward to nonprofit organizations and industry is extremely critical to cultivate. And I'll stop right there and not go to my next point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Bror.
So several things about this are really important. One is the idea that aspirations of students tie directly to what you talked about, the connection between the institution, where they're going, and the community they're going to. That the closer those connections are, which could be revealed by internships and externships, right, as well as mentorships that come backwards, it creates a real pull outwards that can help everybody get grounded. Another thing that's related to aspirations is students coming into environments like Kaplan University, which is very similar to a community college in terms of students' backgrounds. They may come in thinking they want to be a nurse, but they don't actually know what all the roles in health care are. They've just seen a nurse helping their family and they thought that was great and that's what they'd like to do. So part of what you can do from an aspiration standpoint in an institution is, as they start, is to begin to open horizons and make it become more visible what else they could do. And then when you're on your best game, you don't lock them into the first thing they thought of when they came in, but this is why the competencies and stackable credentials are so valuable. You start to be able to resort the cards as folks actually discover what all is in a healthcare environment they didn't know before. And they don't feel like they're derailed, they feel like they're guided to their real dream for the future. The other thing about affiliation that's so important is how it has an impact on academic performance. We're actually doing experiments with Todd Rogers, who's a behavioral economist at the Kennedy School, looking at connecting students very explicitly to their social network by getting the students to volunteer somebody who they know, who will agree to send an email. We send them an email when the student's about to get into something tricky, and the study supporter then sends an email to the student and says, we know you're in it deep, this is going to be hard, but I'm in your corner, let's go get them. And it turns out in other environments this is very helpful, and we've just found that if we send that note to both the student and the study supporter at the same time, it seems to make a significant improvements in the student's abilities and willingness to dig in there and get through it. So that affiliation, that sense of I'm in a network and my network is with me as I do this, has really important consequences for actually finishing programs and making progress.
So it may sound squishy, but it actually produces hard outcomes.
Yep.
Sweet.
Exactly.
So I want to push us to the value part of this conversation. And Sonya, I'm going to come to you first because there's a lot of conversation right now about free when it comes to community colleges. So I'd love to hear you just talk for a second about broadly how you think about that, but in particular, The only example we have right now of free education is public K-12. And on the outcomes front, that has not necessarily played out well, especially for the folks who need it most. And so how do we make sure that as we have this conversation, that the outcomes that we want for the students that are in the community college system get what they're looking for, not just something that's not, doesn't cost them anything?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I believe in is that higher education, at least the first 2 years, should be something that everyone should have access to and complete. I believe that, and it was in fact validated in the conference when folks talked about artificial intelligence and robots and automation, that the level of education, the level of knowledge, skills, and abilities needs to really, we need to up our game, not just for a few, but for all. So that idea, I think, is sort of getting crystallized as fundamental. The question is, what is the vehicle to get to that? How do we get to the idea to make college a reality for all? Is it free community college? And it has been promoted from the White House to states grappling with it. And my perspective is that the goal is not the free college. The goal is really to get students to have the knowledge, skills, and abilities. That is the goal. And getting a college degree right now, if we treat it as a proxy measure of that goal, then let's roll up our sleeves, let's make it happen. Who was it who mentioned that in Singapore, apparently they give a $500 tax incentive to go ahead. So you have a whole country that's behind it. But coming from California, where the tuition is $46 per credit, compared to, let's say, Oregon. I was in Oregon 10 years ago, and at that time it was about 96. So the idea of students having skin in the game and a shared responsibility model in higher ed is probably where I lean towards. So when we're trying to apply the goal as student success and student learning, then at our college, we've done sort of the renegade promise. What the White House is promoting is a promise through making sure that a student can get a college education for free. So it's either subsidized by the state or it's subsidized by private philanthropy. So that's sort of the understanding. And in California, students are subsidized quite a bit. So coming to the shared responsibility model to sort of wrap up this concept, at Bakersfield College, we have the students at a certain GPA. They come in, they have to be college ready. So that's a huge piece. They have to get into college level English and college level math. And then they have to sign a contract that if they're not doing well, they get into study halls. So it's kind of a boot camp approach, whether the study hall is actually a physical space or it's a virtual space where you go, you practice your writing in an interactive setting, or you practice your mathematics. So the student has to commit to time on task with the 10,000 hours, right? Time on task from their end, and they sign the contract. On our end, as a college, what we're committing to them is we have a mentor. You talked about that network. So we provide a mentor for the student, and we've also provided the student to counselor ratios are really small. So I'll kind of conclude by saying that when it comes to kind of the equity agenda, if your presidents or CBOs or COOs in your organization, one of the things that we have done is to figure out where do you scale with high tech and where do you actually go with low student to faculty ratio in terms of high touch. So by understanding the disaggregated data, which is like my big message, then what happens is we can really scale up orientation using and other aspects of learning to the high academic achievers and creating teams and so on. And then with those who are not academically prepared, who are high-risk populations, we're able to repurpose those dollars in actually the high tech to get them into, the high touch to get them into being high tech. That's it.
Got it. And so, thanks for that. And so, you two are very different ones, where in fact students, there is a pretty high price point in some cases for the tuition. Students are taking out debt. How do you think about the value equation for those folks and making sure that they feel like they've gotten a real return.
Well, at one level, I have to say, when people talk about, free education, there's a missing piece, which is the huge amount of labor the student is putting into their education. So to call it free is a little bit almost disrespectful to say, well, it's easy now. And it's like, no, it's not. It's hugely difficult. So you want to be careful in terms of value. Think about whether you're wasting students' time or not. The fact that it's zero cost does not mean it is valuable yet. Are the outcomes good, and is the effort not wasted? So that's a piece of it. And for us, yes, we have a charging model. It's a different part of the system and how we do things. But there, what we've been looking at, too, is information, especially out of Kaplan University, about, well, what happens after folks graduate? Our students come in, and they're usually older, they work, things like that. And so we can look at data on the lift in student salaries after finishing their work with us and see which programs are showing very strong kinds of outcomes like that. And in a couple of cases, we've literally closed programs because they're not actually adding value to students. And so, that's not what Kaplan is doing. We want to be adding value to students and having it be empirical. Now, it also has to be said, simply lifting your salary is not everything about your future. There's no question about it. Dana Gioia actually had a great phrase for this. He was the director of the National Endowment of Humanities a number of years ago. And he said the purpose of education should be to produce productive citizens of a free society. So productive citizens is this thing about the salary and the money and the job. But citizens of a free society is also an incredible obligation too. I mean, folks who are working in accounting are going to have to vote on stem cell research. Well, what is a stem and what is a cell? There's work to be done here. And so it's a bigger picture than salary. And yet, for a lot of our students at Kaplan University, that's a really important goal, and so we're willing to make it an important measure of what we do.
I agree.
I'm coming to you guys next.
It's one of the reasons that, when I first began speaking, I talked about the salary increase with respect to what we saw for our MBA at UNC students, is that it is important that people get a return on their investment, and that it does drive real value to them. And I also think it's really important to think about what it is that people are looking for out of these programs, and tie back to the aspiration piece. With an MBA degree, it's a little more straightforward, because even though there are a lot of different things you can do with that, people are very much looking for career advancement, salary advancement. That's a significant part of why they're looking to do an MBA degree. But a master's in social work may have there may be people who are looking at it very differently. You still want them to be productive, to be employed and to be actively engaged in that field and doing well and getting real value out of it. But you shouldn't look at somebody who is a recovering investment banker, as I am, who chooses to go into social work as a failure from a return standpoint, even though they're going to have a massive salary decrease. If from an aspiration standpoint, they are looking to make this change because they want more satisfaction, want to make more of an impact on society. And so we have to think about measures of success in terms of these programs that aren't just salary based as well.
Thank you. I want to come to you all. I'm sure someone here has a question or a question that they'd like to put forward. Craig?
To what degree does subjective satisfaction of your graduates with the programs that they're involved in come back and affect your respective programs as part of the evaluation?
So the question was, what role does student satisfaction play in how we think about the programs?
So for 2U programs, that's a massive thing that we focus on very, very aggressively. So we measure net promoter scores, which is one measure of satisfaction, both from a student perspective and from a faculty perspective, for every course, for every program on a quarterly basis. And pay very close attention to it to look at what do we need to be focused on, whether it's around technology, the asynchronous content, the synchronous content in a particular class? Is there an issue with an individual instructor that we need to make sure that we're communicating with?
I was going to push you on.
Okay, go
Sonya?
Yes.
Awesome.
I'm going to say maybe. So this is the problem. I mean, I just wish learning was simpler, right? If it weren't for the people, this whole learning thing would be so easy, okay? So here's the problem. The research on student views of their own learning shows that often students, especially novices, prefer learning approaches that are not as effective for them. So you end up stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? And this does come up. There's a lot of research to draw on, and then you wind up looking at something, and it looks like it's going to make students miserable. What do you do? Or semi-miserable. So the answer that we come to is to say, look, if this is a very hard and important outcome, we're going to do what the learning research says we need to do. If it's something that's actually quite easy for students, then you don't have to optimize, and that way you can get it all done. But in the same way that you don't ask the 6-year-old, would you like a needle in your arm on this visit? Right? Oh, no, thank you. Let's put that off, right? We know that we're going to make it as painless and fun as possible, but we've got to get a needle in the arm to get the vaccines going. So it's not as bad, thank heavens. But it is still a bit of this. You've got to be clear about where you want to be guided by satisfaction and where you really want to be guided by the outcomes. And it's going to end up being an outcome by outcome trench warfare rather than an overall, how'd it go. So I wish it were simpler, but that's kind of been our experience.
And the question is also how you word your satisfaction survey.
Yes, very much so.
Are you happy? Or are you, your critical thinking? I mean, it depends on how you frame the questions in the perception survey that you send out.
Got it. Next question? Really? Yes.
There's been, over the last probably 10 years, a lot of discussion about what are the proper measurements, whether it's 3 A's, we have 5 A's. Can you predict the future as to where within the next 5 to 10 years these discussions are going to coalesce about what measurements are actually going to be the ones that are used?
No.
Oh, wait a minute. I got some thoughts.
Go ahead.
No, I can't quite get there with a lens, but in fact, what will happen is, especially with increasingly, hopefully successful simulation environments that allow students to really practice more of what they're going to do at work in their learning environments, those simulation environments are going to be increasingly instrumented to tell you how are they doing with learning. Because really, you don't care about a multiple choice test. You care, can they successfully do this work the way a good person at work actually decides and does it? And so I actually think as more automation comes into certain parts of it, you can actually have less assessment because the engine themselves are showing students becoming more fluent, making better decisions, requiring fewer hints and that kind of thing. So I actually think you're going to see a merging of kind of assessment with actual just instruction and practice through the data that's flowing through the whole thing. So I think that's what
go ahead, Sonya.
And I would add that with the advancement of technology, I think the ability to demonstrate the knowledge, skills, and abilities of our student is going to be vastly improved. It's not going to be a transcript. So if you're able to walk around with your iWatch, to sort of bring together the different pieces of learning that has happened. And also, at least at our college, we right now have sort of the hard skills and then the critical thinking, the mental skills, the thinking skills. But again, Saul Khan talked about the grit and the perseverance, and then to get Jim's affiliation, I think those are going to start getting documented as well in the future.
Yeah. So I agree with everything that was just said. And so the question becomes on knowledge, skills, dispositions, and behaviors, are there going to be better methodologies for measuring those things and telling people whether they hit them? That, I think, is definitely going to happen in many ways like was just described. Whether or not we evolve to actually have a broader view of how we hold institutions, consider institutions valuable and hold them accountable based on a broader set of metrics, that's what I don't know. What I'm hoping for, frankly, why we are here today is I'm hoping the answer is going to be yes. That we're going to create a context where the broader set of definitions is actually what gets incorporated. And the reason that I'm very focused on this is because of the equity issue. because I am very clear who is going to get tracked into a very narrow definition of what education is about if we don't actually start to broaden the definition and recognize that that's a valid way to think about it. So with that, I'm like at 34 seconds. We're not going to go over, I'm sorry, sir. So what I would like to do is give each of you the opportunity to say anything that you want to say to close out, and then thank you all. Sonya?
Well, to close out, I would say that even though technology is advancing and even though there's credentialing and badging, and I think there's going to be an evolution that's going to happen that will still position higher ed in a different kind of a way. And I think the role of higher ed is not going to be necessarily knowledge providers, but it's more developing, let's say, the agency of a student that Daniel Pink talks about, which is sort of autonomy and purpose and those other kinds of attributes. So I do think we'll have a higher ed in the future, but in a different shape probably.
Interesting.
So if there was one thing I would suggest all of you go out and think about asking or demanding from folks out there is ask about valid and reliable assessments of learning outcomes that are tied to what the best people in a domain decide and do. If we had those coming into the disciplines increasingly over time, we'd start to have a real target against which to tell which institutions and which practices are making a difference to students' potential and lives for the future. So that would be, it's a funny thing to talk about that. 'Cause I know assessment is a bit of a third rail, but if it can be done well as a task-oriented piece, as we've been talking, it's really powerful as a driver of all the rest.
The only thing I'd add is, what you said about making sure that we're taking a nuanced view, more of a holistic view of how we're measuring outcomes, I think is going to be incredibly important. To Bror's point, if only it were easy. And some of the things that you talk about in the A's framework are hard to measure and hard for us to think about the data around them. But I think if we don't try to take a more holistic view of the outcomes, then I think you're right that we'll get railroaded to a lot of unintended consequences of trying to measure things in too narrow a way.
Thank you. So will you join me in thanking this fabulous panel?